Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining in and welcome to the newest webinar for the Public History Collaborative, Home Cooking and History. My name is Reed Battles. I'm currently the Assistant Director for Fall 2021 of the Public History Collaborative. And before we get started, I'm just going to do a quick introduction about what the PHC is, as well as who is cooking for us today. All right, so the Public History Collaborative, or the PHC, is an initiative in the Department of History at the University of Arizona that encourages and supports faculty, students, and staff engaging in collaborative projects and working with the public to create projects. The Home Cooking and History webinar series is one of our new programs. In addition, we offer monthly workshops for individuals and groups embarking on projects at their beginning stages to share their ideas, to get feedback, and to network. Before COVID-19, we held the workshops in our new makerspace in the Cesar Chavez building on campus. All of our programs are virtual now, and if you would like to be one of the chefs in the Home Cooking History series and/or share your project idea in a workshop, please reach out to us via email at phc@email.arizona.edu. And so I am going to post our socials. We have Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I'll post our socials in the chat later on. And so now we're going to, before we give it away to Dr. Lawrence, we're going to do a quick introduction. Benjamin Lawrence is cooking for us. He is a legal historian and works in Africa and West African migrants around the globe. His research explores mobility, labor, and exploitation through time and space, and he has written about historical and contemporary slavery, human trafficking, cuisine and globalization, human rights, refugee issues, and asylum policies. And so he is also going to be teaching a food course next semester, History 328, where he will be cooking 3 meals. You guys will all get to cook, which sounds very fun if you ask me. And so if you're a student, that is a good class to sign up for. And so we're going to give it to Ben. He's going to take it away. And thanks for attending. All right, Ben, you're good.
Great, thank you. Welcome, everybody. My name is Benjamin Lawrence, and I'm going to be today sharing with you what to do with your Thanksgiving leftovers. Now, the cuisine that we're going to be experimenting with today is called a fricassee, and a fricassee has a long history in European cuisine, but we're of course adapting it for the turkey. And the turkey, as you're all probably aware, comes from the Western Hemisphere, and it entered the European cuisine through the Columbian Exchange. So this is not just a interesting dish that you can experiment with all your Thanksgiving leftovers, but it's also a dish that speaks to globalization, transculturation, and the movement of food around the globe. I'm going to move some slides through. So I'm going to go back and forth for the screen, back and forth between the screen and the kitchen area. This is a brief summary of the recipe today. If you don't have some of these items, that's perfectly fine. It's not a fixed recipe, as we'll see in a moment. It's actually a long historical recipe that has changed over time and can be adapted in all sorts of ways. You can substitute a number of different items on this menu, and you can make it vegetarian. You can even make it vegan if you wanted to. There are a number of different substitutions, and I'll narrate those while I'm making the dish. But the main items on your ingredients list, I list here. And so if you have those with you, that's great. If you don't, if you want to pause the video, if you're watching this later on, you can go and get those items together. But it's pretty simple. Butter is an important element, but you can also use oil if you prefer. We need sour cream or thickened cream. Again, you could use a substitute. Mushrooms, I use brown mushrooms or white mushrooms. A stock, I suggest chicken or a turkey stock, and I have made a turkey stock here from Thanksgiving turkey. You don't need to do that, but that's a great way to recycle your turkey, or upcycle if you prefer. And a number of other items, obviously chopped turkey pieces. We have a lot of turkey that we're using for today. turn it into something more interesting than cold turkey sandwiches, we're going to be using parsley, celery, chives, carrots, onions, white wine, or if you prefer a white vinegar or a sherry, and you don't need to use that. That's really for flavor, and I'll speak about that in time. And then also some seasoning. And I've also given you a suggestion of some of the tools and implements you need. So a large pot, a small pot, a frying pan, a whisk, a wooden spoon, a measuring spoons, measuring cups, and so forth. You can probably work your way around the kitchen without all of these implements, without too much difficulty. Okay, so what is a fricassee? So a fricassee is a stew or a warm hot dish that you can see one picture of here, chicken fricassee. It is a stew-like dish that has its origins in European cuisine in the medieval period. It's usually made of meat that is browned in butter, and it's expanded with a broth. So we start with cooking the meat in the big pot, browning it, and using the butter to do that. Separately, we can make a roux, which I'll explain in a little bit. It's a sauce base made of butter and flour. People can add all sorts of different types of proteins to it. Most common is chicken. A chicken fricassee is probably the most common meal that you might find that is a fricassee. It's on a menu in a restaurant, for example. And you can use turkey, you could use rabbit if you happen to have that, or you could use a tofu or a seitan if you want a vegan alternative. Historically, it's a great dish to combine lots of available ingredients in the kitchen that you have left over. So you'll see here that I'm using a fresh carrot, but I'm also using some cooked carrots that are also leftovers. So you can use all sorts of leftovers that you have around the kitchen. One of the earlier, clearest recipes is in English language, is from Hannah Glass's Important the Art of Cookery. And that describes a fricassee that involves rabbit. And the American chef Julia Child described fricassee as somewhere between a saute, which doesn't involve liquid, but just frying in butter, and a stew, which involves liquid from the inception. So a fricassee is actually somewhere in between, because you start by frying things up, and then you move into adding the liquid. It has its early origins in medieval Europe, late medieval Europe. The earliest recipe we have describes a fricassee, possibly French or Swiss in origin, and it comes from Le Viandier du Taillevent. And this first recipe, or this first book from the 14th, 15th century, provides a suggestion for what a fricassee is. It's a combination between frying and chopping. And that's how we get the term fricassee in French. Le Viande de Taillement is from the late medieval period, and Guillaume Tirel, who was cook for the King of France, this is probably a staple meal on the dish, on the circuit in the courts of France. And in early modern European cookery, it quickly spread from France to other parts of the world. Many of the well-known chefs shared recipes, shared menu items, and they moved, of course, from court to court. And so it enters Britain certainly in the mid-1500s, because it appears in a number of cookery books, including The Perfect Cook, which describes a type of fricassee made with lamb and leftover lamb, including a lamb's head. So you can use it to extract flavor from lots of leftover parts of an animal. So it's a very efficient dish. Early fricassees were thickened with egg yolks. We're not going to be doing that today. We might use some lemon, which is more common in the Italian version of fricassee. Okay, so back to our ingredients and recipe today. As you can see, I just want to go through again. We have the turkey here chopped. I'll be chopping it in due course. We have carrots. I have some celery. I've already chopped those. I have half an onion that I've chopped. I have some mushrooms that I've broken up, ready to saute. I have sour cream, and also I have a heavy whipping cream. You can use either of these or a combination of both. I have some butter that I have cut into thirds. I'm going to be using part for the mushrooms and the rest for the meat. I have some chives I don't have parsley, so we can leave that out, but you can use dried parsley or fresh parsley. I have a chopped lemon, and then I have nutmeg, salt and pepper, white wine, and I already mentioned my turkey broth that I made from the carcass of the Thanksgiving turkey. Okay, so we're going to get started over here on the stove. I'm going to be first doing two things simultaneously. The first is I'm going to be sautéing the onions and the mushrooms together. So I'm going to take a third of that butter, put it on there, let it melt. You can break it up so it melts a little more quickly. And we'll be using that butter to brown the onions and brown the mushrooms. The ideal that you want to get to is something that looks a little bit like that. So here's some that I prepared previously that have been browned in butter, but I'm going to show you how that goes because it'll take a bit of time to cook down a little bit. So I put the onion in first. Make sure that the onion that has been chopped relatively finely. You can chop it coarsely if you prefer. It's really not a problem. I make sure that the butter evenly distributes around the onions, so that is slowly warming up there. I'm cooking on gas, which I like because it's faster than using many of the types of electric stoves. But my hope in the future is to be able to get rid of the gas and return to using solar power from our solar cells on the roof. I seem to have changed the screen. We've lost the screen share, but that's fine because we don't need that menu for the moment. We'll come back to that perhaps in a moment. So then I'm going to be putting those mushrooms that have been broken up or chopped. I'm going to be mixing those into the onion and letting that start to saute on a medium to high heat. I don't want them to burn, but I want them to cook down a little bit to reduce a little bit of the moisture inside the food, inside the product. And I'm going to leave that and occasionally stir that over the next few minutes. While I'm doing that, simultaneously, I'm going to be starting to make the roux. And the roux is begun with some butter. So you take another third of that butter that we previously separated into thirds, and you let that quickly melt in the pot. For a roux, and the roux is basically a combination of butter and flour. It's not something that you need to do. You can use corn flour or cornstarch if you prefer to thicken, and you don't want to have a gluten-free option. You don't need to use butter and wheat flour, but that's a traditional roux, so I'm going to start with that. It should be relatively simple. Basically, you're creating an emulsion which is a perfect dispersal of fats within another product. So in this case, it's a dispersal of butter fat within some white flour, and then we'll start to add some stock to that to create a thickened sauce. And that sauce will become the base for the whole dish. And then finally, while that's starting to melt, I'm going to be getting ready to cook the turkey. So here you can see I've just pulled turkey off the carcass. It's not yet chopped up. And since we're now starting to work with food, it's probably a good idea to remind you to always wash your hands before cooking, before preparing. As you can see, I already prepared these foods. I previously washed my hands with soap and water, but that's a very important part of healthy and safe cooking. So as you can see that over here, the mushrooms are starting to brown a little. You can see their color is changing. And I'll keep doing that. The butter on over here is already melted. So I'm going to turn that right down to low so that it doesn't burn. We don't want the butter to brown and burn. We want it to stay just melted. And you put in the equivalent of about 1 tablespoon of flour. So I have measuring spoons here, but I'm doing what we like to call bucket chemistry because I've done this so many times. I know exactly what I'm looking for in terms of volume. But basically, you've got 2 tablespoons of butter and up to a tablespoon of flour. We created emulsion. The emulsion, as you can see here, is perfectly distributed butter and flour, and it's the base for a thickening sauce, and you can use this to thicken any type of sauce. We're going to use it today to thicken a turkey broth sauce, so this will become the base for the rest of the dish later on. And now that it's melted, I'm just slowly adding tablespoon upon tablespoon of the sauce of what is of the gravy, sorry, of the stock, and you can already see here that it's thickening into a thicker sauce that will become the base for the dish. So I'm going to keep adding up to half a cup of the turkey broth until we have a thick base sauce that will then set aside and continue on with the rest of the dish. Now, this might seem like a complicated dish, and it's because I'm separating it into smaller parts, but you can also make it much more simply by just putting it all together, throwing all the items together, and sauteing them in the pot. I'm not going to make it that way today because I want you to see all the individual items as they're being cooked. So the sauteing onions and mushrooms are browning nicely. The thickening sauce is reaching an ideal thickness, an ideal viscosity that we can use later on in the actual fricassee. So now that that's ready, I'm going to set aside this thickened sauce. You want to take it off the heat so that it doesn't continue to cook. The mushrooms and the onions are starting to look very nice. They're starting to look very brown, and I'm not going to add any seasoning at this point. We're going to add some seasoning later on. So you just keep gently stirring that. And now we're going to turn to our big pot. So I mentioned previously you need a big pot. Here's the type of pot I'm using, stainless steel. And I like to use this as my favorite cooking pot for a stew or a soup. I'm going to take the last part of the butter. As you can see, here's the last third. I'm going to put that in the pot, let it melt quickly on a high heat. And while that's happening, I'm going to start chopping up the turkey. So you can see that the turkey is both dark meat and light meat. You can use any type of meat you want. You could use beef, you can use chicken, you could follow Hannah Glass and use rabbit if you prefer. As you can see, I'm using a chef's knife to cut it into small bite-sized portions. The goal is to have about 10 to 14 ounces of chopped turkey. Over on the stove, the butter is now melted, and I'm going to start adding this turkey so that it browns. Now, of course, the turkey is already cooked. This is a cooked turkey from Thanksgiving. We don't need to use a cooked protein. You could start with raw protein and cook it as well. So in this case, the butter is simply browning what is already cooked, but you could start with uncooked protein such as chicken or uncooked turkey. That's just going to involve a little bit more cooking time at the beginning so that the chicken or the turkey or the other product is more carefully sauteed through. So in my pot over here, the turkey is being mixed around in the melted butter. And I'm just going to keep adding the turkey over time while that cooks. The onions and the mushrooms are starting to look almost ready. Ideally, you want to cook your mushrooms down to this level so you can see they're nice and soft. And they've got a nice brown glaze. You can see the onions and the mushrooms now have got to an almost optimal saute level. I'm going to keep that on for a few more minutes while I chop up some more turkey. So the turkey is sauteing in the butter, and I'm going to start quickly chopping some more turkey. And just a warning about knife skills. I don't have great knife skills, but so far I've generally avoided losing any fingers. If you're less familiar with using knives in the kitchen, then I recommend that you practice on something easy like a tomato or an onion or celery. That's the sort of food product that helps you practice your knife skills. Basically, we're looking for cubes of food, cubes of protein about this size. And the reason we cook food, sorry, the reason we chop food in an even size rather than just throw it all in is because we want things to cook at a similar rate and evenly. So one way to aid that process, one way to make sure that things are cooking evenly is to make sure that things are chopped and cut up at the right size and the same size. If there are any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat and we can pass them on to me. If there's anything that I'm going through too quickly or not making clear, just let me know. Now, we've almost finished chopping up the turkey. The rest are small pieces that are almost the ideal size anyway. I'm going to throw them all in together and make sure that they're all lightly browned in that butter. If I could bring the camera over to the pot, you could see how it looks. I'm just going to tip the pot over for you so you can get some sense of what we're looking for. And there you can see the brown turkey at the bottom. Now, on the left side here, the onions and the mushrooms are really at the optimal stage now, so I'm going to take them off the heat and I'm going to start to add them into the turkey that's cooking. So that's what I was going for. Nicely browned onions and mushrooms, rich in flavor, releasing lots of flavonoids, lots of chemicals in that browning and caramelizing process. And that's also what you're looking for with the protein. The goal by caramelizing is to increase the flavor in the of the ingredients, to extract that flavor for optimal effect. So in our big pot over here, we now have, I'm going to add these mushrooms that I cooked earlier. We now have a lovely combination of mushrooms, turkey, and onions. And I'm just letting that heat all the way through because there was some colder mushrooms that had been cooked previously and the last few bits of turkey that I'm going to add. And that is the final, the penultimate stage rather, before we start to add the other ingredients and the broth. So I'm going to finish cutting up these last bits of turkey, and I've done that. I'm going to add those into the mix. And the brown protein now is looking very, very golden, and it's really the optimal. You could see here in the bottom of the pan, we're looking for a nice even roundness coating with butter. And we're pretty much ready now to start adding the other ingredients. So I mentioned previously I'm going to be using celery. I chopped up 3 sticks of celery relatively coarsely. I'm going to add those to the mix. Celery, onions, and carrots are a very fundamental part of European cooking. Often together they're referred to as a mirepoix, which is the 3 cooked together. I'm now adding the carrots and the similar volume of carrots as it was celery, both cooked and uncooked carrots. So I'm using some of Thanksgiving's leftovers, and I'm just mixing that around, making sure it's evenly distributed. And we have now basically the fundamental elements. Everything else, with the exception of the stock and the cream, is really an addition. So just to remind you of our menu, I'm going to go back to the screen share. You can see all the elements in the recipe. So most of the vinegar or white wine or seasonings and celery, or I'm going to add some nutmeg today. These are things that you can or you don't need to add. It's really for your flavor, for your choice, as you see fit. Okay, so that's cooking over here, and I'm now going to start to add the stock. And I've previously made 9 cups of turkey stock from the turkey carcass. I've filtered that so it's just the stock, but if you prefer, you can use the stock with bits of turkey in it. I'm going to actually use that later on myself for making a risotto. I'm going to make another round of stock too. So it's a great way to reuse that turkey rather than just throw it out. So I'm going to measure 1 cup of stock and now a 2nd cup of stock. And you can hear that the sound of the sauteing has decreased because now there is a liquid in there. So we're basically doing the transition that that Julia Child alluded to when we move from a saute into a stew. So I put in just enough stock so it's almost covering the food, almost covering the turkey and the vegetables, but not quite. Now I'm going to get ready for the next stage, which involves cream and white wine and maybe a bit of vinegar. My white vinegar is under the sink. You're probably wondering, why do I keep my vinegar under the sink? I keep it there because here in Tucson, the water is pretty hard, so I always throw half a cup or a quarter of a cup in with the dishwasher to make sure that the glasses come out clean. So there's my little Tucson hack for you. So I'm going to turn the heat up now because I want this to very quickly come to a boil. If I could bring the camera over, you would see that there are still some ingredients popping out of the liquid, so it's not quite covering everything, and that's because the purpose here is just to bring everything up to the same temperature before we start to add the final ingredients in the recipe. I'm going to get those ready now. I have set aside some sour cream. We had sour cream in our mashed potatoes, so that's leftover sour cream. We have some whipping cream, also leftover from Thanksgiving from the pie. So I've basically got about 1/4 cup of cream there and about 2/3 of a cup of sour cream. Again, as I mentioned earlier, these are sort of informal volumes. The recipe I've provided gives you more specific examples, but I've made this dish so many times that I tend to just eyeball it in terms of those volumes. So the sauteed product, the sauteed ingredients, which have now had the first 2 cups of liquid added to them, are now just at that point of simmering. And so I'm going to start adding the other ingredients. So the first is, as I said, about 1/3 of a cup of whipping cream. Here's a 1/3 cup measure that I'm going to use. So you can see what we're talking about in terms of, oh, it's more like 1/4 of a cup actually. Going to add that in to the mix. And then the sour cream, which is probably about 2/3 of a cup. So there's 1/3. And then 2/3. You can hear it's bubbling now, so it's reached simmering point just below a full boil. That's what simmering means. So just below a full boil, You want that simmering temperature because it makes sure that everything is cooked through. When it's simmering, you know that all the ingredients have reached the same temperature. But you don't want it on a full boil because full boil can very quickly lead to the pan burning in the bottom. You don't want to avoid that. So I'm going to mix that cream in now, and we already have something that could look quite like a fricassee. It's almost at its final stage. I'm going to now add some white wine. I like to add about a cup of white wine. This is just a cheap Italian white, $2 chuck, or in this case, $3 Whole Foods white wine. You can use any white wine. You don't need to use white wine. I think white wine and cream and chicken or turkey go together really well. It adds a certain tartness, a certain acidity to the recipe that counterbalances the power of the turkey and the mushrooms and the cream. I'm going to add about 1/4 cup of white vinegar. So I have a measuring spoon here, 1/4 cup of white vinegar. Again, a similar effect. You can use white vinegar, you could use white sherry, dry sherry, you could use apple cider vinegar if you prefer. And now we're really almost at the final stages of the dish. The stew is looking very much like a stew, but with those new ingredients, it's dropped off from simmering. It's lowered a little, so we're going to wait it again till it comes back up to a full simmer before we add some more stock. While we're waiting for that to happen, I'm going to chop up the chives. So I've added chives to this menu instead of parsley. You can add parsley or chives. You can add rosemary, whatever you have lying around in the kitchen. I encourage people trying this recipe to experiment. See, I'm struggling here with my knife skills, but I've chopped up those chives relatively coarsely, and I'm going to throw that into the pot. Another useful hack when you're cooking is always use the back of your knife to scrape into the pot, not the blade of the knife. And by doing that, you will avoid the knife getting unnecessarily blunt. And so I'm going to start to add the final spices and herbs and seasonings. Salt and pepper here. I'm going to add about 2 pinches of pepper and about 3 pinches of salt. We'll be tasting it later on. It's always important to taste the dish 2 or 3 times while you're cooking and right before serving to make sure that seasoning is balanced. But I can, from experience, know that we're going to at least need 3 pinches of salt. It's come back up to a simmer, and with those chives in there, it's starting to look a very beautiful color. I'll bring that over to the camera so you can see what it looks like. With some oven mitts. So you can see that we're looking for a nice creamy sauce that contains big chunks of protein and vegetables. Back on the heat. And I'm gonna, now that it's returned to a simmer, I'm gonna add 2 more cups of stock. So 1, 2. And at this point, all the ingredients are immersed, right? So of course, there are a few things like mushrooms floating to the surface, but that means you can mostly see chives on the surface because all the ingredients are fully immersed. And I'm going to add a little bit of nutmeg. I like nutmeg in savory dishes. It was actually very common in the medieval and early modern period, and then sort of becomes, over the course of the last century, more of a sweet baking item along with cinnamon and other baking spices, but it actually is a delicious addition to proteins. So a little sprinkle of nutmeg into that. And finally, I'm going to add the roux that we made earlier. That is nice. You can see it's a thickened sauce, and that's just going to help the dish as it cooks for the final few minutes and becomes a nice thick. So this almost looks like a gravy. That's because it's basically what it is. It's a gravy. It's composed of butter, flour, which is a roux, and then we've added turkey broth, the turkey stock that I made earlier this morning. And I'm just going to add that into the dish, and that will facilitate the thickening of the stew, because I like a thicker fricassee. I don't want it to be too watery. You don't need to have it in this particular way. You could have it more a more runny, less viscous if you prefer. But I like to have a sauce that simmers and thickens, simmer down, so it's reducing the amount of liquid, making the sauce thicker, richer, and creamier. That's my preferred choice in a fricassee. And now we're really in the final stages. So I'm going to just leave that to simmer. And I'm going to bring the camera over so you can see a little more clearly what it looks like. So you can see there the sauce is simmering nicely, and it's got on the top a sort of browny yellowy look. That's because the fats from the sauce are rising to the surface, the fats in the cream and the butter. And that's just going to simmer. So there we are. There we have a traditional fricassee. A traditional fricassee can be served with any number of starches. I think it goes particularly well with pasta or rice, but this is Thanksgiving, so maybe you still have leftover mashed potatoes. I know we do, so we'll be eating it probably tonight with mashed potato for dinner. Maybe tomorrow we'll be eating it with pasta, and maybe on Tuesday we'll be eating it with rice, because there's plenty of fricassee there. So the final element I'm going to add is a little bit of lemon. I'm going to add that when the dish is cooked and I'm serving it. So just a splash of brightness, like a squeeze of lemon over the sauce that you have poured over your mashed potato. Again, I'm going to make sure before I serve it that it's well seasoned. So I have a little ladle, take a bit of the sauce out and check. Check the seasoning level. I think it needs a tiny bit of salt, but I'm going to leave it to cook a little longer before I make that final call. Now you can leave that to simmer for 5, 10, or 15 minutes, but you could serve it right now if you wanted to. I'm going to leave it to simmer so it's a little thicker before I serve it, and that's really your choice. And I hope you've enjoyed this meal. And it's been my pleasure to share this with you. If you're interested in learning more about the history of cooking, please consider taking my history course 328. In that class, we cook a number of dishes, both what I call pre-Columbian cuisine and post-Columbian cuisine. And we work in a professional kitchen with professional kitchen staff to facilitate the preparation of those foods. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. That looked really good. I have a couple of questions. So first off, kind of more personally, you said you've cooked it a lot of times. Is this something that you grew up cooking in your childhood, or is it something that you kind of came to later in life when you started cooking more by yourself?
Good question. Thank you. Yes, this is definitely something that my mom taught me. Almost everything I know about cooking goes back to her. This is a fricassee would be something that my mom would just announce we're having as if we knew what it was. I didn't know what it meant or what the history of it until I did a bit more reading around it. But I certainly learned how to cook it long before I knew what it was. And yeah, we would eat it after what in Australia, where I grew up, would be after Christmas. So in Australia, often people have a turkey for Christmas like they do in Britain. A turkey that is, again, something from the United States that's spread across the Atlantic, and from Britain it went to Australia. So it's pretty common in Australia to eat turkey at Christmas time. We certainly don't celebrate Thanksgiving. And so my mother always liked to have the largest turkey that she could possibly find. Easily, I think the biggest one we had once was 26 pounds. So there's always enormous amounts of turkey left over. And she would make a variety of different dishes, including a turkey fricassee. So I learned this growing up as a child.
That's really cool. When you were cooking it, it reminded me of my childhood after Thanksgiving. We also would have a lot of turkey left over. My mom always made like turkey soup. So it was really kind of cool to see very similar ingredients, just going, but more into a stew than a soup. So it's fun to see how food, across the globe has very similar ingredients, even if they're different products. And then I have another question historically. I don't know but do you think this was something that was cooked with leftovers, or this is something that, it would be prepared for a specific event, or it'd be just like, we have some scraps left in the kitchen, let's kind of batch everything up together?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question because we don't really know much. We only know these early recipes from the late medieval and early modern period, which have been recorded, but they're obviously, almost certainly, I should say, recipes that have been used for decades, if not centuries before, that have then been written down. Most of the early cookery books and early recipe books are really compendia of other recipes that have been shared among cooks and chefs, among kitchens, among families. So the earliest recipes we have of things like a fricassee involve using things like a sheep's head or the bones of a carcass. And so it was one way to really stretch a meal much further and to reuse or recycle or upcycle what would previously have been thrown away. Now, when I say previously thrown away, however, I really think it's important to understand that most people didn't throw things away historically. That is a very recent development. Today, by some estimates, a third or more than 40% in some cases of US food goes directly into the trash. So if you're talking about restaurants, it's upwards of 50% of food that goes through a restaurant ends up in the trash. And in American homes, it's somewhere around 1/3 of all food ends up in the trash. That is a modern inconvenience caused by the types of foods that we have and refrigeration. In the historical past, a fricassee would have been just one of a number of different dishes that people could turn to in order to use what was available in the kitchen, which would have involved carcasses and body parts that we normally throw away. And so I think it's quite reasonable to say that it would have involved leftovers. As you saw, I used some cooked carrots and leftover turkey. I'm going to be serving it with leftover mashed potato. Maybe once upon a time, that would have been a pretty standard meal. In the late medieval and early modern periods, a bowl of food, so a terracotta bowl, maybe if you were in some sort of pub or something like that, would have featured a broth or a stew, maybe with some barley or some other type of grain. It wouldn't have involved potatoes, which come from South America, and it wouldn't have involved mashed potato. It probably wouldn't have involved rice, because that arrives in Europe also relatively recently. It certainly didn't involve corn or polenta or pasta. These are things that have come into the cuisines of modern Europe quite recently, with the exception of pasta in Southern Europe. But primarily it would have involved something like barley. Maybe they would add a cup of barley to the stew toward the end to give it extra substance and to stretch it further in a family or group setting. And that would probably, or spelt or other types of grains, that would really stretch it further. You could also add things like turnips, parsnips, or other root vegetables. So absolutely, it's a dish that would be adapted to leftovers because people didn't throw things away as we do today.
Very, very interesting. Okay, and I have one more question. Is this going to be a dish that you would find at like a French restaurant? I mean, the name obviously has French origins. Is this something that you would find in restaurant cuisine or something that you would most likely make at home with, leftovers like you just talked about?
Yeah, so the term fricassee is clearly French, and if you ask a French chef or a French cook about a fricassee, they'll have their own recipe. It's certainly a staple in French cuisine. Whether you'd find it in a restaurant or perhaps a bistro or a cafe is a different question. So in France, a restaurant, historically at least, is formal dining and involves multiple courses. So a fricassee might feature in one of those courses, but probably will be given a different name, or it's a similar type of dish, but with perhaps a different name. But you might see something like a rabbit fricassee in some restaurants in France. More likely, though, you'll see it on the menus of small country inns or bistros or tavernas or similar types of more informal dining, where you can simply order from the menu or whatever is the prefix, whatever is on the menu, the staple dish, the standard dish. So it's something that if you drove around France, parts of Italy, certainly parts of Britain today, in the country, you would find this in inns, pubs, and small bistro type of establishments.
Awesome. Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions before we kind of we don't want to keep you, I mean, we have a couple minutes, but we don't want to keep you over one. Any other questions?
Well, I don't see any other questions, but I want to thank you again for taking the time to cook with me in the kitchen. I've enjoyed sharing my experience and sharing with you fricassee, which is an annual fixture on our calendar. And I wish you all and you and your families a happy Thanksgiving.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. Once again, take History 328 for students watching this. There was a lot to learn just in that recipe, and so I'm sure you can learn a lot about food history through cooking itself. But yes, thank you very much for helping out. And then before we wrap up, I just wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Paul Milliman, a faculty member in the Department of History whose idea this was for home cooking and history, as well as Dakota Hodgeboom, our admin. She's just been wonderful with helping us out, setting this up, spreading the word, and getting everything situated. So thank you for that. And then of course, thank you, Maria, the director of the Public History Collaborative, for helping me set this up and encouraging this project.